Leah took a deep breath and closed her eyes, letting the soft, mournful notes of her violin drift through the tiny apartment that had become her family's refuge. The music was her solace, a temporary escape from the reality they had been forced to accept. Her father, once a household name in the classical music world, sat hunched over a faded manuscript at the dining table. His once pristine suit jackets were now frayed at the cuffs, and his sharp, commanding presence had dimmed under the weight of failure and financial ruin. In the adjacent room, Leah's mother lay on a threadbare couch, coughing softly. The medications for her chronic illness were expensive, and Leah often stayed awake at night calculating how they would stretch their dwindling funds to cover them. Leah's younger brother, Oliver, sat cross-legged on the floor, his fingers dancing over the keys of a battered keyboard they had managed to save from the sale of their estate. He was a prodigy, destined for greatness, but their circumstances made formal training an impossible luxury. As Leah's bow moved across the strings, her father looked up, his face creased with worry. "Leah," he said softly, "can we talk?" The conversation that followed felt surreal. "We've been approached," her father began, choosing his words carefully, "with a proposal. It's unconventional, but it could solve many of our problems." Leah frowned. "What kind of proposal?" Her mother shifted on the couch, propping herself up on an elbow. "An arranged marriage," she said, her voice hoarse but firm. The words hung in the air like a discordant note. Leah stared at them, disbelief and anger flooding her chest. "You can't be serious." "It's Daniel Carlyle," her father said, his tone placating. "The son of William Carlyle. You know the name." Leah's stomach turned. Everyone in the classical music world knew William Carlyle, the powerful music mogul whose wealth and influence extended far beyond the industry. "He wants to associate his family with our legacy," her father continued. "He sees it as mutually beneficial, prestige for them, and stability for us." Leah felt a surge of defiance. "What does that even mean? I'm supposed to marry a stranger so they can boast about being tied to our name?" Her father leaned forward, his eyes pleading. "It's not just about us, Leah. It's about Oliver's future. Your mother's health. We can't keep living like this." Leah looked away, her gaze settling on Oliver. He had stopped playing and was watching her intently, his young face shadowed with worry. "Do you really think this will fix everything?" Leah asked, her voice trembling. "It's a chance," her mother said. "A chance we can't afford to pass up." That night, Leah lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling of her room. Her violin rested in its case by the bedside, a silent reminder of the world she had been born into and the sacrifices her parents had made to nurture her talent. She thought about her mother's fragile health, her father's defeated expression, and Oliver's unfulfilled potential. By morning, she had made her decision. The meeting with the Carlyle family was arranged swiftly. Leah's parents coached her on what to wear, how to act, and what to say. They reminded her of the importance of making a good impression, though the words felt hollow in her ears. As she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the neckline of her simple dress, Leah wondered what Daniel Carlyle was like. Was he complicit in this arrangement, or was he being coerced like her? Her father appeared in the doorway, his face etched with guilt. "Leah," he said softly, "I know this isn't what you wanted." "It's not about what I want," Leah replied, turning to face him. "It's about what we need." That night, Leah sat by the window, her violin resting on her lap. She played a slow, mournful melody, her emotions pouring into the music. Her future felt uncertain, her identity reduced to a bargaining chip in a world that valued power over passion. But as she closed her eyes, she reminded herself of why she had agreed to this, her family. And for them, she would do whatever it took. The Carlyle summer home was everything Leah expected and nothing she wanted to face. The sprawling estate was a testament to wealth, with its pristine gardens, marble columns, and a driveway so long it seemed to stretch into another world. Leah stepped out of the car, clutching her purse case tightly for comfort. The grandeur of her surroundings was overwhelming, a stark reminder of the world she was stepping into. Her parents had stayed behind, insisting that meeting Daniel alone would allow the two of them to build an initial connection. A butler, immaculately dressed, greeted her at the door with a polite bow. "Miss Renner, Mr. Daniel Carlyle is expecting you. Please follow me." Leah's shoes clicked softly against the polished floors as she followed the butler through the mansion. Every detail, the art on the walls, the shimmering chandelier above, the faint scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air, spoke of a life far removed from her own. Daniel was waiting in the library, a grand space with shelves of books that climbed to the ceiling and a massive fireplace that dominated one wall. He stood by the window, his hands in his pockets, gazing out at the perfectly manicured grounds. At the butler's announcement, he turned, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Renner," he said, extending a hand as she approached. "Daniel," she replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm but impersonal, much like the man himself. The formality of the exchange set the tone for their meeting. Daniel gestured for her to sit in one of the leather chairs near the fireplace, taking the seat opposite hers. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice smooth but devoid of warmth. Leah nodded politely, unsure how to respond. The conversation began stiffly, each of them feeling out the boundaries of their shared predicament. "You've had a long drive," Daniel said, his tone bordering on disinterested politeness. "It was manageable," Leah replied, folding her hands in her lap. "And you're a musician?" he asked. "Yes," Leah said. "I trained as a violinist at the conservatory." Daniel nodded. "I imagine music has always been a central part of your life." "It has," Leah said, adding cautiously, "though my family's circumstances have made it more complicated recently." Daniel's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Curiosity, perhaps? Circumstances can often complicate the things we love. Leah tilted her head, intrigued by the slight shift in his tone. "Do you speak from experience?" Daniel hesitated, his jaw tightening briefly. "I suppose I do." Their conversation barely scratched the surface of who they were. Daniel seemed polite but distant, treating the meeting like a business obligation rather than a chance to connect. Leah couldn't help but feel like an afterthought in his meticulously curated world. Still, she caught glimpses of something beneath his polished exterior, a tension in his shoulders, a certain weariness in his eyes. It was clear that, like her, he was carrying the weight of expectations he hadn't chosen. Later, the butler escorted Leah on a brief tour of the estate while Daniel excused himself for business. The mansion was stunning, filled with priceless art, gleaming marble, and vast rooms that felt more like galleries than living spaces. When they passed the music room, Leah paused, drawn to the grand piano and the rows of instruments on display. "This is the music room," the butler explained. "It hasn't been used much in recent years." Leah stepped inside, her fingers brushing the edge of the piano. The room was beautiful but lifeless, like the rest of the estate. "Does anyone play?" she asked. "Not anymore," the butler replied. "Mr. Carlyle's father believes appearances matter more than practicality." Leah frowned, the words striking a chord she hadn't expected. Meanwhile, Daniel retreated to his study, where his father, William Carlyle, was waiting. "How did it go?" William asked, his tone brisk. "As expected," Daniel said, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "And?" "She's polite. Talented, from what I can gather. But this is about the arrangement, not her." William nodded, his expression calculating. "Exactly. Don't forget why we're doing this. Her family name carries weight in the classical music world. That association will only strengthen our brand." Daniel's grip tightened around his glass. "I understand. You do well to focus on the bigger picture," William said. "This is about the Carlyle legacy, not personal feelings." Daniel didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the amber liquid in his glass. By the time Leah left the estate, her thoughts were a tangle of doubt and resolve. Daniel had been distant, almost mechanical, but she couldn't ignore the flashes of sadness and frustration she had seen in him. As the car pulled away, Leah looked back at the towering mansion. It was clear that this marriage was just another transaction for the Carlyle family, a way to merge prestige and power. But for Leah, it was a hope for her family, a chance to give her brother the opportunities he deserved and her parents the stability they desperately needed. She closed her eyes, leaning her head against the cool glass of the window. For better or worse, this was her reality now. The wedding day was a spectacle Leah had barely begun to process. From the moment she woke, the estate was abuzz with activity, stylists, caterers, and florists bustling about, ensuring every detail was flawless. Leah sat in a makeup chair in a guest room of the Carlyle mansion, her reflection in the mirror barely recognizable. Her gown was a masterpiece, ivory silk with intricate lace detailing that cascaded down the skirt. The veil, light as air, framed her face, and her hair was swept into an elegant updo adorned with pearls. She looked the part of a society bride, but inside, her emotions churned like a storm. Her mother sat nearby, her frail hands clutching Leah's. "You look beautiful, my darling," she said softly, her voice tinged with pride and sadness. Leah forced a smile, her heart aching as she thought of all the sacrifices her mother had made. "Thank you, Mama." Her father entered, his suit impeccable but his expression serious. "Are you ready?" Leah nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "As ready as I'll ever be." The ceremony took place in the estate's grand ballroom, transformed into a vision of opulence. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in a warm glow, while rows of gold chairs lined with white roses faced the ornately decorated altar. The guest list read like a who's who of the classical music and business worlds, their whispers filling the room as Leah stood behind the heavy double doors, waiting for them to open. Her father offered his arm, and she took it, her knees trembling beneath her gown. "You're doing this for the family," he reminded her, his voice steady. "For the family," Leah echoed, willing herself to stay calm. The doors opened, revealing the glittering crowd. Leah's heart pounded as she stepped forward, her eyes finding Daniel at the altar. He stood tall and composed, his expression unreadable as he watched her approach. The ceremony itself felt surreal, a blur of vows and music. Leah recited the words she had memorized, her voice steady despite the whirlwind inside her. Daniel's responses were equally measured, his tone betraying none of the emotions he might have felt. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, Daniel leaned in, brushing a light kiss against her cheek. The gesture felt rehearsed, almost clinical, but the crowd erupted in applause as if they had witnessed a love story. The reception was equally grand, with champagne flowing and a live orchestra providing an elegant soundtrack to the evening. Leah moved through the crowd like a ghost, offering polite smiles and nods as strangers congratulated her on a future she didn't recognize. Her solace came in fleeting moments, watching her father reconnect with former colleagues from the music world, seeing her mother's eyes light up as she spoke with old friends. For a brief moment, Leah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this sacrifice would be worth it. As the evening wound down, Leah excused herself, the exhaustion of the day settling heavily on her shoulders. A maid escorted her to what would be her room in the Carlyle mansion, her room, separate from Daniel's. The space was lavish but impersonal, a reflection of the family's wealth rather than warmth. Leah sat on the edge of the bed, her wedding gown pooling around her, and let out a long, shaky breath. Her violin case rested on a nearby table, the one possession she had brought with her. She opened it, running her fingers over the polished wood, and began to play a soft, melancholy tune. The music filled the room, a private expression of the emotions she couldn't voice. For the first time that day, Leah allowed herself to cry. Meanwhile, in another wing of the mansion, Daniel sat alone in his study. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, staring into the flickering fire. His father's words from earlier echoed in his mind, "This marriage is a strategic move, nothing more." Don't lose sight of that. Daniel set the glass down, his jaw tightening. He had complied with his father's demands, as he always did, but the emptiness in his chest felt heavier than ever. Leah awoke the next morning to sunlight streaming through the tall windows of her new room in the Carlisle estate. The opulence around her, the gilded furniture, the silk curtains, the pristine white linens, felt as foreign as the life she had just entered. She dressed carefully in a simple navy dress, unsure of what the day would bring. A maid arrived with breakfast on a silver tray, setting it on a table by the window without a word. "Thank you," Leah said softly, but the maid merely nodded before retreating. Leah stared at the food, perfectly poached eggs, fresh fruit, and a croissant that looked like it had been plucked from a magazine. She wasn't hungry, her appetite dulled by the weight of uncertainty. The estate was vast, a labyrinth of rooms, hallways, and staircases. Leah wandered through it after breakfast, her footsteps echoing on the polished floors. The grandeur was overwhelming, every detail meticulously designed to project wealth and power. There were drawing rooms with velvet sofas and gold-framed mirrors, a dining hall that could seat 50, and a ballroom even larger than the one where her wedding had taken place. But for all its beauty, the estate felt cold. There were no personal touches, no photographs or mementos, nothing to suggest warmth or connection. It was a house designed to impress, not to be lived in. Leah rarely saw Daniel. He was always busy, his days filled with meetings and phone calls in his father's study. When they crossed paths at dinner, the meals were quiet and formal, with little more than polite exchanges between them. "I trust you're settling in," Daniel said one evening, his tone distant. "As well as I can," Leah replied, forcing a smile. Daniel nodded but didn't press further, returning his attention to his plate. One afternoon, as Leah wandered through yet another hallway, she came across a set of double doors slightly ajar. Curious, she pushed them open and stepped into a room that took her breath away. If the music room in the summer house had impressed her, this music room was unlike anything she had seen. A grand piano dominated the space, its glossy surface reflecting the sunlight streaming through the windows. Shelves lined with sheet music covered one wall, while another held violins, cellos, and other string instruments displayed like works of art. Leah's fingers itched to play. She approached the violin stand, selecting an instrument that felt right in her hands, and began to tune it. The moment her bow touched the strings, she felt a wave of relief. The music poured out of her, filling the empty room with a melody that spoke of longing and hope. For the first time since arriving at the estate, Leah felt a sense of peace. The music room became her corner of the house. Each day, she spent hours there, playing until her fingers ached. She explored the sheet music, finding pieces she hadn't played in years, and even began composing her own. It was the one place in the mansion where she felt free, where the weight of her circumstances lifted, if only temporarily. The soft strains of Leah's violin filled the music room, her fingers gliding effortlessly over the strings. The melody she played was one of her own compositions, a piece that spoke of yearning, uncertainty, and hope. As the final note lingered in the air, a soft sound made her turn abruptly. Daniel stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said, his tone quieter than usual. Leah set the violin down, her pulse quickening. "It's all right. I wasn't expecting anyone." Daniel stepped into the room, his gaze sweeping over the instruments. "I couldn't help but hear you. You play beautifully." "Thank you," Leah replied, unsure of what else to say. There was a pause before Daniel asked, "Is it something you wrote?" Leah nodded. "I've been composing for a while. It helps me process things." Daniel seemed intrigued. "You're not just talented, you're gifted." "I had no idea." Leah smiled faintly, her fingers brushing the edge of the violin. "I didn't think it mattered. This marriage wasn't about who we are as people, was it?" Daniel flinched slightly at her honesty but didn't argue. "No, it wasn't. But that doesn't mean you're not remarkable. The unexpected compliment caught Leah off guard. "Thank you," she said softly, meeting his gaze. Since their marriage, this was the first time Daniel seemed genuinely curious about her. He asked about her training, her inspirations, and the music that shaped her. Leah found herself opening up, sharing stories of her childhood and the deep love of music her family had nurtured. "My father used to write pieces for my mother to sing," she said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. Their collaboration was magic. "It's what made me fall in love with music." Daniel listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "It sounds like your family lived through music. I can see why it means so much to you. What about you?" Leah asked, her curiosity piqued. "Do you have any connection to music?" Daniel hesitated, then gestured toward the piano. "My mother used to play that for me. She loved Chopin and Debussy. I didn't appreciate it as a child, but now I miss it." Leah felt a pang of empathy. She must have been very talented. "She was," Daniel said, his voice soft. "After she passed, my father made sure I didn't waste time on frivolous things like music. Everything became about the business." Leah frowned. "That sounds lonely." Daniel chuckled dryly, though there was no humor in it. "It was. But it was also what was expected of me." Their conversation stretched long into the evening, the initial awkwardness giving way to something deeper. Leah saw a side of Daniel she hadn't before, a man shaped by duty and loss, longing for connection but unsure how to find it. And Daniel, for his part, began to see Leah not as a pawn in his father's schemes but as a person with her own dreams and struggles. "You're different than I thought you'd be," Daniel admitted as they stood by the piano, the room bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. Leah raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "I thought you'd resent me," he said, his voice careful. "And maybe you do. But you're also kind. Resilient." Leah studied him, her defenses softening. "I didn't know what to think of you either. But I'm starting to see there's more to you than I assumed." Daniel smiled faintly. "I suppose we're both full of surprises." That evening, over dinner, Daniel broke the usual silence. "Have you ever performed publicly?" he asked, his tone curious. Leah hesitated. "Not since the conservatory. I've always played for myself or my family." "Why do you ask?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Your talent shouldn't be confined to this house. The world deserves to hear you." Leah blinked, taken aback. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that." "You're more ready than you think," Daniel said firmly. Leah studied him, searching for hidden motives but finding none. His encouragement felt genuine, and she wondered if he truly believed in her. That night, as Leah sat in the music room, she replayed Daniel's words in her mind. His belief in her abilities had been unexpected, and it stirred something inside her, a flicker of confidence she hadn't felt in years. Perhaps this marriage wasn't entirely what she had feared. And perhaps Daniel was capable of being more than just a distant stranger in her life. The morning sunlight streamed into the dining room as Leah picked at her breakfast, her thoughts still lingering on the conversation she and Daniel had shared in the music room the night before. His words had stayed with her, "The world deserves to hear you." Across the table, Daniel sat reading the day's business reports on his tablet. The soft clink of his coffee cup as he set it down broke the silence. "I have an idea," he said, looking up from the screen. Leah raised an eyebrow, setting down her fork. "What kind of idea?" Daniel's tone was calm but purposeful. "There's an industry gala next month. A major one. I think you should perform." Leah blinked, taken aback. "What?" "No, I." "Hear me out," Daniel interrupted, leaning forward slightly. "The gala is filled with influential people in the music industry. Perform there, and it could open doors for you, opportunities to collaborate, to compose, even to study further if you want." Leah shook her head, panic rising in her chest. Daniel, I haven't performed in years. I'm not ready for something like that. You are, Daniel said firmly, his eyes locking with hers. You just don't see it yet. But I do. The idea unsettled Leah for the rest of the day. She found herself pacing the music room, her mind racing with doubts. The thought of standing on a stage, playing for an audience of strangers, filled her with dread. When Daniel found her later that afternoon, she was seated at the piano, staring at a blank sheet of music. I know it's a lot to ask, he said, stepping inside. Leah glanced up at him, her expression troubled. You're asking me to step into a world I haven't been part of in years. What if I fail? You won't, Daniel said simply. Leah frowned. How can you be so sure? Because I've seen you play, Daniel replied, his tone softening. You don't just perform, you connect. You make people feel something. That's rare, Leah. His words caught her off guard, stirring an unexpected warmth in her chest. But it's not just about your talent, Daniel continued. This is about showing my father, those people at the gala, and the entire industry what you're capable of. You don't have to fit into anyone's expectations, Leah. You can define yourself. That evening, during dinner, Daniel brought the idea up to his father, William Carlyle. A live performance from Leah would be a highlight of the gala, Daniel said casually, as if the decision had already been made. William frowned, his fork pausing midair. I thought the purpose of the gala was to showcase our newest partnerships, not to host an amateur concert. Leah stiffened, feeling the sting of his dismissive tone. With respect, father, Daniel said, his voice measured, this is a strategic move. Leah's talent adds authenticity to our connection with the classical music world. It strengthens our position, showing we're not just patrons but part of the culture itself. William studied his son for a long moment, his calculating gaze flicking briefly to Leah. Finally, he set his fork down. Fine. If it serves our interests, I'll allow it. Leah's hands tightened around her napkin, the pressure of his words settling heavily on her shoulders. Later that night, Daniel found Leah in the music room again. She was pacing, her violin case unopened on the piano bench. I don't think I can do this, Leah said as soon as he entered. Your father barely approved, and I don't even know if I'll be good enough. Daniel closed the door behind him, leaning against it. You'll be better than good enough. You'll be unforgettable. Leah turned to face him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Why does this matter to you? Daniel hesitated, then stepped closer. Because I believe in you, he said simply. And because I know what it feels like to be underestimated. You deserve to be seen for who you are, Leah, not just as part of this arrangement, but as an artist. Leah's breath caught, his sincerity disarming her. Over the next few weeks, Daniel helped Leah prepare for the gala. He arranged for a rehearsal space in the city, where Leah practiced tirelessly. At first, she struggled to find her rhythm, her nerves getting the better of her. But as the days passed, her confidence began to grow. With each rehearsal, she felt more in control, rediscovering the passion and skill that had once defined her. The night before the gala, Leah stood in the music room, playing the piece she had chosen one last time. The melody was a reflection of her journey, soft and tentative at first, but building to a crescendo of strength and resolve. When she finished, Daniel was waiting in the doorway. Ready? He asked, his voice warm. Leah set the violin down carefully. I think I am. Daniel smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. Good. Because tomorrow, the world will finally see what I've discovered. You're an extraordinary musician. The night of the gala arrived, the grand ballroom of the Carlyle family's flagship hotel glittering with chandeliers and the dazzling attire of industry elites. The event was an orchestration of wealth and influence, with every detail designed to impress. Leah stood backstage, clutching her violin tightly as the murmur of the crowd buzzed just beyond the heavy velvet curtains. Are you all right? Daniel's voice came softly from behind her. Leah turned to face him, her nerves evident. She was dressed in an elegant emerald gown that shimmered under the stage lights, but her confidence felt as fragile as the delicate fabric. I'm terrified, she admitted. Daniel stepped closer, his expression calm and reassuring. You've worked hard for this. You're ready. Leah managed a small smile, though her heart raced. What if I make a mistake? Then you'll keep playing, Daniel said firmly. And no one will remember the mistake, they'll remember the passion you put into the music. His words settled her nerves slightly, and she nodded. The MC's voice boomed through the ballroom, introducing Leah as a rising star in the classical world. The applause that followed was polite but subdued. This was an audience accustomed to established names, not unknowns. Leah stepped onto the stage, her heels clicking softly against the polished wood. The sea of faces staring back at her blurred in the bright lights, and for a moment, her vision swam with anxiety. But then she focused on her violin, its familiar weight grounding her. She took a deep breath, lifted her bow, and began to play. The first notes were tentative, but as the melody unfolded, Leah lost herself in the music. The piece she had chosen, a medley of her own composition interwoven with themes from her family's favorite works, was deeply personal. Every note told a story of love, loss, and resilience. The crowd, initially disinterested, began to quiet. Heads turned toward the stage, conversations ceased, and the energy in the room shifted. By the time Leah reached the crescendo, her music filled every corner of the ballroom. It was raw and powerful, a sound that transcended technique and spoke directly to the heart. When she played the final note, the silence was deafening. For a moment, Leah stood frozen, unsure of what to expect. And then the applause erupted. The ovation was thunderous, a standing crowd clapping and cheering as Leah took her bow. She caught a glimpse of Daniel in the front row, his face filled with pride, and a wave of emotion washed over her. As she exited the stage, several attendees approached her, showering her with praise. That was remarkable, one woman said, handing Leah her card. If you're interested in recording, please call me. Another man, a prominent conductor, offered an invitation to audition for his orchestra. You have extraordinary talent, he said. It would be an honor to work with you. Leah felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention but managed to thank them graciously. When she finally found Daniel, he was waiting for her near the side entrance, away from the bustling crowd. You were incredible, he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. Leah's cheeks flushed. I couldn't have done it without you. Daniel smiled. You would have found your way, no matter what. I just gave you a nudge. The next day, the industry buzz was undeniable. Leah's performance had made an impression, and the offers began pouring in, opportunities to perform, collaborate, and even compose for upcoming projects. William Carlyle, ever the opportunist, wasted no time in capitalizing on the success. This is exactly what we needed, he said to Daniel during breakfast. Her performance has elevated the family's reputation in ways money never could. Daniel's expression hardened. She's not just a tool for your ambitions, father. She's a person. And her success is hers, not yours. William raised an eyebrow but said nothing, surprised by Daniel's defiance. Despite the newfound attention, Leah remained focused on what mattered most, her music and her family. She spent hours in the music room, composing new pieces and preparing for upcoming performances. Daniel often joined her, offering quiet support and encouragement. One evening, as they sat by the piano, Leah turned to him with a thoughtful expression. Why did you push me to perform? Daniel hesitated, then said, because I knew you were capable of something extraordinary. And because I wanted you to see it too. Leah smiled, her heart softening. Thank you for believing in me. Daniel met her gaze, his voice quiet. You've made me believe in more than just you, Leah. You've made me believe in us." The weeks following the gala were a whirlwind of opportunities and new beginnings. Leah's name had quickly become a topic of conversation in the classical music world, her performance described as raw, emotional, and deeply authentic. Invitations flooded in, offers to perform at prestigious venues, collaborate with renowned musicians, and even record her original compositions. In the midst of it all, Leah found herself in unfamiliar territory, not just professionally, but personally. Her relationship with Daniel had begun to shift, moving away from the cold formality that had defined their marriage. One quiet afternoon, Leah sat by the grand piano in the music room, a stack of unopened mail on the side table next to her. She had grown used to ignoring most correspondence, bills, advertisements, and the occasional invitation to a society event she didn't care for. But as she absently flipped through the pile, one envelope caught her eye. The stationery was elegant, the handwriting on the front unmistakably formal. Her heart skipped as she read the return address, New York Conservatory of Music. Her hands trembled as she tore open the envelope, her pulse quickening with every second. Inside was a letter on thick cream-colored paper, the words carefully typed but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Dear Miss Leah Renner, we were deeply moved by your performance at the recent Carlisle Gala. Your raw talent and emotional depth have captured our attention. It is with great pleasure that we extend an invitation for you to join the New York Conservatory of Music as a student in our advanced performance program." Leah couldn't read further. Tears blurred her vision as she pressed the letter to her chest, the words echoing in her mind. "It's not over. It's not over." For years, she had believed that her dreams of studying music professionally were out of reach, buried beneath the weight of her family's struggles and her own sacrifices. But now, those words on the page opened a door she thought had been closed forever. Later that evening, she found Daniel in his study. He was engrossed in his tablet, scrolling through figures and charts, but when Leah stepped in, the look on her face made him set it down immediately. "What is it?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. Leah held up the letter, her hands shaking. "I got in," she whispered, her voice catching. "The conservatory invited me to study." Daniel rose from his chair, crossing the room to take the letter from her. As he read it, a smile broke across his face, slow but genuine. "Leah, this is incredible," he said. "I didn't think it was possible," she said, her tears spilling freely now. "I thought that part of my life was over." Daniel gently folded the letter and handed it back to her. "It's not over. It's just beginning. You have to go, Leah. You belong there." Leah hesitated, her joy tinged with doubt. "But what about everything here? Us? Your father?" Daniel cupped her face in his hands, his eyes steady on hers. "We'll make it work," he said. "You've sacrificed so much for everyone else. Now it's your turn. Go. Take this chance." Leah nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. In that moment, she saw Daniel not as the stranger she had married out of duty but as someone who believed in her, truly and deeply. Soon after, another opportunity emerged. At a meeting arranged by Daniel, one of the top music managers working with the Carlisle business proposed that Leah become a session musician at a professional studio the company owned. "You have a gift, Leah," the manager said, his tone warm and encouraging. "We could use someone with your range and sensitivity. It wouldn't just be about performing, it's about creating. We'll pair you with composers, producers, and other musicians. What do you think?" Leah felt a surge of excitement. The prospect of earning her own income, creating music, and reclaiming her independence was thrilling. Since the wedding, she hadn't had a job, and while she was grateful for the financial security, she often felt unmoored. "I'd love that," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Adjusting to studio work was a challenge at first. Leah was used to the flow of live performance, but studio sessions demanded precision, patience, and an entirely new level of discipline. She spent hours recording and re-recording sections, learning to adapt her style to fit the needs of each project. But she thrived under the pressure. Collaborating with other musicians and composers reminded Leah of why she had fallen in love with music in the first place. She finally felt like herself again. The income she earned as a session musician, though modest, gave her a renewed sense of pride and independence. She could contribute to her family in a way that felt meaningful and true to her identity. One afternoon, while Leah was working on a recording session at the studio, her father surprised her with a visit. She had invited him to see her in action, hoping it might lift his spirits, but she hadn't expected the emotion it would bring. Her father watched from the control booth as Leah played a violin solo for a new piece. His eyes glistened with pride, and when she finished, he clapped loudly, startling the engineers. "You've made me so proud, Leah," he said as she stepped out of the booth. Later that day, an old acquaintance of her father's, a composer who happened to be working on the same project, recognized him. "Is that Arthur Renner?" the composer exclaimed, hurrying over. "I can't believe it. Arthur, I could use your help with this arrangement. Your insight would be invaluable." Leah's father hesitated, but Leah nudged him gently. "Go on, Papa," she said. "You've still got it." He joined the composer in the recording room, and within minutes, the two were deep in discussion, tweaking chords and refining melodies. The session ended with a perfectly polished piece, and the studio's producers were so impressed that they extended an offer for Arthur to take on a permanent role as a consultant. Leah watched her father accept the position with a mixture of joy and relief. He had spent years grappling with the loss of his career, and now, he had found a way to reconnect with his passion. As they left the studio that evening, Leah linked her arm through his. "Looks like we're both professional musicians now," she teased. Arthur smiled, his face beaming with pride. Leah walked into the dining room that evening expecting the usual, a quiet meal prepared by the estate's cook, eaten in the polite but distant company of her husband. Instead, the room was bathed in the soft glow of candles, and the usual formality seemed replaced by something warmer, something inviting. The table was set with care, complete with wine glasses and a bouquet of fresh flowers in the center. She paused in the doorway, confused but intrigued, and called out, "Daniel?" He emerged from the kitchen, wearing an apron and holding a dish towel. There was a streak of flour on his sleeve and a sheepish smile on his face. "Good timing. Dinner's ready," he said casually, as if this was a normal occurrence. Leah blinked, her surprise turning into amusement. "You cooked?" He shrugged. "I figured you've been working hard, so I thought it was time someone did something for you." His tone was light, but there was an undercurrent of sincerity that caught Leah off guard. She glanced around. "Where's the staff? Did you scare them all off?" Daniel chuckled, gesturing toward her chair. "The cook has the night off. My father's out of town, so I thought we could have the house to ourselves. No interruptions, no schedules, just us." Leah felt a warmth spread through her chest as she took her seat. The meal he brought out was simple but beautifully prepared: roasted vegetables, perfectly cooked steak, and freshly baked bread. "This looks incredible," she said, genuinely impressed. "Let's hope it tastes as good as it looks," Daniel replied, pouring them each a glass of wine before sitting across from her. The first bite proved delicious, and Leah couldn't help but laugh softly. "I didn't know you could cook." "It's not something I do often," Daniel admitted, "but I picked up a few things during my travels." He seemed pleased by her reaction, a rare hint of vulnerability in his otherwise composed demeanor. As they ate, the conversation flowed more easily than it ever had. They talked about her days at the studio, his ongoing plans to step back from the family business, and their shared thoughts on the life they were starting to build. Leah found herself laughing at Daniel's dry humor, feeling more at ease than she had in months. The meal stretched on, their connection deepening with each passing moment. When they had finished dessert, an unexpectedly perfect chocolate mousse, Daniel cleared the plates, insisting she stay seated. A short while later, he returned, not with another dish, but with a vintage record player and a stack of albums. "Do you like jazz?" he asked, setting the player on the sideboard. "I love it," Leah replied, watching as he carefully selected a record and set the needle in place. The smooth, soulful sounds of Ella Fitzgerald filled the room, wrapping them in a warm cocoon of music. Daniel dimmed the lights, leaving only the glow of the candles, and leaned back in his chair with his glass of wine. Leah followed his lead, the music relaxing her even further. They began talking again, their voices low as they shared pieces of themselves they hadn't yet revealed. Leah told him about her first recital and how her mother had helped her calm her nerves by singing the melody softly from the front row. Daniel, in turn, shared stories of his childhood with a mother who loved Chopin and Debussy, how her sudden loss had left a silence in the house that his father refused to fill. At some point, Daniel stood and offered his hand. "Dance with me," he said. Leah hesitated, caught off guard, but his expression was so genuine that she couldn't refuse. Taking his hand, she let him guide her to the open space by the piano. They swayed gently to the music, her head resting lightly against his chest, and she allowed herself to truly relax in his presence. The hours passed unnoticed as the records changed seamlessly from one to the next. They eventually moved to the sitting room, sinking into the plush sofa and continuing their conversation. Daniel recounted an embarrassing mishap during a business trip that left Leah in stitches, and her laughter was so infectious that even he couldn't help but join in. The night melted into morning, and Leah suddenly noticed the faint light filtering through the curtains. "Is that the sunrise?" she asked, glancing toward the window. Daniel followed her gaze, a small smile on his lips. "It looks like we lost track of time." Leah shook her head, a laugh escaping her. "I haven't stayed up all night talking to someone since college." "Neither have I," Daniel admitted, his tone soft. "But it was worth it." That morning, Leah climbed into bed with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. The loneliness that had once been her constant companion had faded, replaced by the quiet strength of a bond she hadn't expected to find. As the sunlight streamed through the curtains, she drifted into sleep peacefully. The next day, Leah woke later than usual, her body heavy with the kind of pleasant exhaustion that comes from a night well spent. Memories of the previous evening, the dinner, the music, the way Daniel had made her laugh, played on a loop in her mind. She smiled to herself as she got ready for the day, feeling lighter than she had in months. At the studio, her morning was filled with rehearsals and meetings, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Daniel. It was strange to think how far they'd come. When they first met, she'd believed him to be cold and detached, but last night, he had been warm, thoughtful, even vulnerable. When she arrived home that evening, Daniel was waiting for her near the entryway, his jacket already in hand. His expression brightened when he saw her. "Busy day?" he asked. Leah nodded, setting her violin case down. "Productive, but long." "Perfect," Daniel said, his lips curling into a small, mischievous smile. "Because I've got plans for us tonight." Leah raised an eyebrow. "Plans?" He nodded. "There's a spot downtown. Live music, good drinks, a little less structured than what we're used to. Thought it might be fun." Leah hesitated, but only for a moment. After the night they'd shared, she found herself wanting to spend more time with him. "All right," she said, grabbing her coat. "Let's go." The venue was a far cry from the polished perfection of the Carlisle estate. It was small and lively, with low lighting, mismatched furniture, and a stage tucked into one corner where a jazz trio was already playing. The air buzzed with conversation and the hum of live instruments, and Leah felt herself relax almost immediately. Daniel led her to a small table near the stage, his hand lightly resting on the small of her back as they navigated through the crowd. "This is nice," Leah said as they sat down, her eyes scanning the room. "I thought you'd like it," Daniel said, signaling to a waiter. "It's got a good vibe, doesn't it?" Leah nodded, already tapping her foot to the rhythm of the music. She ordered a glass of white wine while Daniel opted for a whiskey, and as they sipped their drinks, they fell into an easy conversation. She told him stories about her college days, laughing as she recounted the late-night practice sessions that would inevitably turn into impromptu jam sessions. He shared memories of his time abroad, painting vivid pictures of bustling cities and quiet countryside retreats. The band transitioned into a more upbeat number, the saxophone player leading the charge with a playful riff. Daniel glanced toward the stage, then back at Leah, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "Come on," he said, standing and holding out his hand. Leah looked at him, surprised. "You want to dance? Here?" "Why not?" Daniel asked, his grin widening. The small dance floor was crowded, filled with couples swaying to the beat and friends laughing as they moved together. Leah hesitated, but Daniel's enthusiasm was infectious. She took his hand, allowing him to lead her into the chaos. He wasn't a particularly good dancer, his movements were stiff at first, his rhythm just a touch off, but Leah found herself laughing as he twirled her clumsily, his confidence far outweighing his skill. "You're terrible at this," she teased, her laughter ringing above the music. "And yet you're still here," Daniel shot back, grinning. The more they danced, the less she cared about the people around them. The music pulsed, the crowd moved, and for a while, it was just the two of them, caught in a moment that felt far removed from the carefully curated world they usually inhabited. At one point, Daniel spun her a little too enthusiastically, and she stumbled, falling into his chest. His arms came around her instinctively, steadying her, and she looked up to find him smiling down at her. "You all right?" he asked, his voice softer now. Leah nodded, her breath catching. "Yeah, I'm good." For a moment, they didn't move, the music and the crowd fading into the background. Daniel's arms stayed around her, his warmth grounding her, and Leah let herself lean into him. It wasn't a grand, dramatic moment, it was quiet and natural, and she realized just how much she trusted him. Eventually, they returned to their table, breathless and flushed from the dancing. The band was winding down, and the hum of conversation grew louder as people ordered more drinks or prepared to leave. Daniel raised his glass, a playful smile on his lips. "To spontaneity," he said. Leah clinked her glass against his, her own smile widening. "And to terrible dancing," she added. They lingered for a while longer, savoring the easy camaraderie that had grown between them. When they finally left the club, stepping out into the cool night air, Leah felt a sense of joy she hadn't expected. As they walked back to the car, Daniel slipped his hand into hers, and she didn't pull away. There was something simple and beautiful about the gesture, a quiet acknowledgement of how far they'd come. By the time they reached the estate, the night had faded into early morning once again. As they stood at the front door, Daniel turned to her, his expression soft. "Thanks for coming with me tonight," he said. Leah smiled. "Thanks for asking me." The sunlight streamed through the windows of the dining room the next morning, casting a warm glow over the table set for two. Leah was already seated, a cup of tea cradled in her hands as she gazed out at the estate gardens. Her thoughts drifted to the night before, the laughter, the music, and the quiet way Daniel had held her hand on the walk back. Daniel entered moments later, his usual polished demeanor softened by a slight scruff on his jaw and an easy smile on his lips. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that sent a flutter through Leah's chest. "Morning," she replied, her own smile blossoming. He poured himself a cup of coffee and joined her at the table. The chef had prepared an assortment of pastries, fresh fruit, and perfectly poached eggs, but Daniel seemed more interested in the quiet moment between them than the food. "You didn't sleep in," she said teasingly, breaking the silence. "Neither did you," he countered with a playful glint in his eye. Leah chuckled softly, setting her tea down. "Last night was fun. I didn't think I'd say this, but your dancing wasn't that terrible." Daniel placed a hand on his chest in mock offense. "Careful, or I might take that as encouragement to keep embarrassing myself." They laughed, the sound filling the room and banishing any trace of the formality that used to linger between them. After a beat, Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression turning thoughtful. "Leah, I've been thinking," he began, his tone more serious now. "What about?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. He hesitated for a moment, then set his coffee cup down. "About us. About everything we've been through these past months. And how, maybe it's time we gave ourselves a chance to really start fresh." Leah's brows furrowed slightly, unsure of where he was going. "What do you mean?" Daniel's lips curved into a small smile, his gaze steady on hers. "I mean a honeymoon. A real one. Just the two of us. No business calls, no obligations, just time to be together, away from everything else." Her breath caught as his words sank in. She hadn't expected it, hadn't dared to hope for it, but now the idea filled her with a quiet sense of longing. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "As serious as I've ever been," he replied, his tone earnest. "We didn't have a proper beginning, Leah. I think we deserve one." Leah felt a warmth spread through her chest, her pulse quickening as she met his gaze. "Where would we go?" she asked softly. "Anywhere you want," Daniel said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Italy, Greece, Paris. Or somewhere quiet, somewhere just for us." His thumb brushed gently over her knuckles. "The destination doesn't matter. I just want to spend time with you." Leah's lips parted, her breath hitching as his words sank in. He wasn't just suggesting a trip, he was opening his heart to her, offering a chance to deepen what they had begun to build. "I'd like that," she said, her voice trembling slightly but full of emotion. Daniel's smile widened, a flicker of relief in his eyes. He stood, still holding her hand, and guided her to her feet. The morning sunlight bathed them both in its golden glow as he stepped closer, his free hand brushing a strand of hair from her face. "For the record," he murmured, his voice low, "I'm glad you said yes." Leah barely had time to respond before Daniel leaned in, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was both tender and full of promise. Her hands instinctively rested on his chest as she kissed him back, her heart pounding as the world seemed to fade away around them. When they finally pulled apart, their foreheads rested together, and Leah felt a breathless laugh escape her. "That was overdue," she whispered. Daniel chuckled softly, his thumb brushing her cheek. "Agreed." They stayed like that for a moment longer, the silence between them now filled with something new, something deeper. And as they returned to the table, making plans for a future that felt brighter than she had dared to dream, Leah realized that this wasn't just a new beginning. It was the beginning of everything.